Hello, my name is Daniel Podgorski, and this is a video I'm making to celebrate reaching 25,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel associated with the Gemsbok, which is a website I started a while back to share my writing with people. 25,000 is wild to me. It is well beyond what I thought was ever going to be possible. So I wanted to do something special to celebrate that. I wanted to do something a little different, something that would feel unique and new. And so I'm making this video. And in addition to the format, which you can probably already tell is outside of what I would normally do, it is also unscripted. All of the reviews you're going to hear are improvised. But don't make the mistake of thinking that that means that these are uninformed reviews. These are not Let's Plays. These are not first impressions. These are not first looks. Every single game I'm going to be covering here is a game that I have completed at least once. And for over half of them, I've even got 100% achievement completion on it. So these are games that I know really well. And even beyond that, for every single one of them, there is some specific topic I want to talk about. I have some angle, some specific topic. So in addition to being a mini review, each of these will also be kind of like a mini improvised video essay. And this video is not the only way that I'm celebrating or marking this occasion. I want to be able to justify spending as much time as I possibly can on Gemsbok stuff, on writing and video production, and just generally making as much of this kind of material as I possibly can. And in order to make that a reality, I've finally taken the advice of so many people that have told me over the years that I should open a Patreon account in order to support all of the work that goes into this, all of the recording and all of the writing and all of the editing and all of the video production, everything. In exchange for your support, I will be offering a lot of the usual stuff you'd expect out of a Patreon, like credits and a little bit of early access, some behind the scenes info, stuff like that. But in addition to all of that, maybe the most unique thing I'm offering is anybody backing at any tier will gain access to an exclusive monthly live stream where I'll be playing games and chatting with people. And the very first thing I'm going to be doing on those streams is attempting a very unique challenge run of Dark Souls 1. So if that sounds interesting, check it out. Anyway, this is a video that's about indie games. Games made by small teams, in some cases literally just one person. If you haven't been delving into indie games in the last 10 or 15 years, your eyes are off the ball. You've missed where the industry is at its best, is at its most interesting. Truly. This is where the lion's share of the innovation is. This is where the lion's share of the good ideas, and to be honest, even the good games are. Well, I mean, you probably know that if you're watching this channel, but if not, people are sometimes really weird about games being 2D. People are sometimes really weird about games being in pixel art. Get over it. That's what a lot of the best games look like. Anyway, let's take a look at some interesting games. Ynglet, very underrated platformer without platforms. I've covered the notion of platformers without platforms before in my Flyer Wrench review. I mean, it is a little bit of a lie to say it's a platformer without platforms. Instead of platforms, what it has are regions that you move through, that you dash between to navigate the levels. In addition to that, it also has a very unique respawn system where anytime you're in a stable region, one of these blocks or circles, and you just hold still for a second, it becomes the checkpoint. So that just turns into your new checkpoint. You can basically save anywhere, provided you're not in a transitional or transitory block space. But the main thing I want to talk about actually is difficulty. Ynglet actually has a set of difficulty options, and this is somewhat rare for a pure platform game, even one without platforms. When you boot up the game for the first time, you open the file, you're prompted to select your difficulty, and your difficulty options are, I think it's chill, tricky, and challenging. So I was playing through this game in challenging, the highest difficulty, and I was surprised to find that it was a very, very, very easy game. And that's not a problem. That's fine. A lot of games just are designed that way. I've talked a bit in the past about how the Kirby series has these very forgiving mechanics, especially the way that it handles the jumping. And it's just supposed to be welcoming. It's supposed to be friendly. You have to really hunt for stuff that's tough, tucked away at the end of Kirby games. And that's fine. I mean, they just cater to a different audience. It's okay. They have a vision, and they hit that vision. But I would think, okay, that's fine. It's not where I want to be spending the majority of my time these days. And so that was my first impression of Ynglet, and it was done in about an hour. And what's more is the levels felt a little clumsily arrayed. When you play a Kirby game, there's a lot of really intentional puzzle design and a lot of really intentional combat design, despite the fact that they are such easy games. But when you're playing through something like this and you find it to be too easy, sometimes that just means it feels haphazard. So what I mean by that is, if you look at a level in Ynglet, there's no particular match between the distance you can dash or the distance you can move when you're at max speed and the gaps you're having to cross. Most platformers, for example, are designed around a very locked down, fixed jump distance, with the idea being that once your development team knows that distance, knows how far your character can get, they can tune everything around that. So they can make every gap look exactly the same, pretty much. They can set gaps at such varying widths that it's clear whether a single jump or a double jump is needed at a glance, or, a long jump or whatever is available. By knowing these specific jump widths and then matching the level to it, you end up with something that feels very natural, that looks very natural, that just works really well. There are almost no situations like that I encountered when I played through that campaign of Ynglet. I played through the whole game, the whole campaign, and this is what I mean by saying it felt haphazard. It felt like the platforms were just placed almost at random, and that's why it wasn't that hard. Okay, so my time with Ynglet was up, the campaign was over. I was like, okay, that was it. It looks interesting. It's a cool looking game. You seem to be playing as some kind of amoeba or something. You kind of look like one of the characters from that game company game Flow, but I was done. However, then something happened that I was not expecting at all. On finishing that short little 1 hour campaign, the game unlocks another difficulty setting, which it calls too difficult. That's what it calls it. Too difficult. All right, I thought. I'm not really interested in just immediately jumping straight back in and playing that game again, but I am interested in this higher difficulty setting, and the game actually has some bonus content. At the time, it had 1 extra campaign. Now it has 2 extra campaigns in it. So I thought, okay, I'll hop into that, set it to too difficult, see what that's like. And it was great. It was fantastic. It was what I was describing a moment ago. It actually matched the level design to the capabilities of the player character. So suddenly, without bouncing in the right angle, you weren't going to get the right momentum, you weren't going to make it to the next platform. Suddenly, the mechanics felt right. It felt like everything was well designed, like the levels were well designed. And it became clear to me that what had really happened here, that how the game had been made, is that this locked away final difficulty setting was how the levels were designed originally. I mean, listen, I could be wrong, but the impression I get, because this is the way that they actually function in a way that feels natural and matched to the character's abilities, that they actually work at the extremity of what's possible there, that's the way the levels were actually originally laid out. And then, to make the 3 difficulty settings that are the only, and I'm not saying that you could see one locked out at the start either. There were just the 3 and nothing else. That to make those 3 difficulty settings that the game presents as its only difficulty settings, they just kind of placed extra platforms. They placed extra regions, extra blocks, extra circles. They just placed more and more of them to fill it out, to make it easier, to make it easier, to make it easier. Which is fine. That's a perfectly fine. In fact, honestly, that's a high effort, really admirable way of doing difficulty settings in a platformer, is to actually change the levels to make them have more forgiving jumps, to make them have these less demanding gaps, these less demanding timings. All of that is, I think, really commendable. What's really strange and not commendable is locking away what feels like by far the best way to play the game. The way of playing the game that matches the player character is hidden, is locked, and not just locked, but is a secret, basically, that you can't access, and which, once you unlock it, discourages you from playing it, calls itself too difficult. It's too much. It's not fit for human consumption. But that's the way that the game feels natural and well designed. I mean, that was when it clicked and I was having fun playing Ynglet. It didn't just match my abilities, it matched the character's abilities. So in summation, what I'm trying to say is I don't see why the developers of Ynglet thought that a Legend of Zelda style hidden hero mode was an appropriate way to conceal the best version of their game. Genuinely. It is a game that is fantastic, that for some reason desperately wants you to believe it's mediocre. It is hiding the fact that it's great. You know, it's one thing when you tell somebody, here's a TV show, it ran for 9 seasons, but the first season isn't the best. They hadn't really figured out all the character relationships or all of the character traits or what roles they filled the best yet. The writers hadn't really hit their stride yet. But if you push through that first season, you've got 8 seasons of really terrific material there. But, I mean, we're talking about a situation where, you know, there's 3 one-hour campaigns in this game. There's the main one, and then there's these 2 bonus campaigns. And I think it's a harder sell to say, here's a 3-hour game, a third of it is bad. If you've played platformers before, unless you find the art and the sound effects super duper enamoring, the first hour is kind of like a clumsy tutorial or a clumsy cutscene that you have to hold right through. But if you just get through an hour, then you can play a good game for 2 hours. I think that's a harder sell. Yeah, so I can understand why somebody wouldn't figure out that it's a good game, and I could understand why people would avoid it. It's inexpensive, it's attractive, it's cool, it's fun, but it really doesn't look it. It really doesn't want you to know that. It's a secret. It's a secret to everybody. Tunic is a game with 50 amazing ideas that has been mostly praised for one of them. Now, that one idea, which is making pages of its in-game conlang manual be it one of its main collectibles, is a fantastic idea. It is incredibly cool. It will continue to feel cool as long as not too many games copy it. It's amazing to me. It does work really well. I understand why it has vacuumed up so much of the attention around the game. It kind of reminds me of the way that the Demon's Souls message system would have originally encouraged players to stay in the game and solve mysteries there where they're getting these hints, instead of popping out to immediately look up a separate wiki or guide. Another great idea is the way it incentivizes using consumables. Such a big problem in RPGs, such a big problem for people to just hoard their stuff, to not want to throw their bombs, to not want to take their potions. And it's such a simple, obvious solution to just give you more for free if you use a lot of them. And especially to do that in a progressive way, where you unlock even more of them for free the more you use. So you are just always like, I need to make sure I'm using these to unlock more of them. In such a simple way, they have solved such an old problem in RPGs. And it is kind of an old solution too, because it does remind me of what the game is so inspired by, which is Zelda 1, where Zelda 1 had very specific rules around when and how you get item rewards from enemies. You had to know all that stuff in advance or test for it to understand it as a player, but the system was there. But yeah, because of the way its mysteries work, and because of how engrossing and strange its world is, and obviously because it's about a little fella in a roughly top-down perspective swinging a sword, Tunic is such a good spiritual successor to The Legend of Zelda for the NES. You know, I once made an entire video about the fact that I think The Binding of Isaac, with its top-down perspective and its room-based transitions and the way that it does these wave-based challenges with these specific projectiles and the way it does its secrets and everything, means that it kind of is just a series of Zelda 1 dungeons, back to back to back to back, without the overworld. But obviously it is nowhere near the kind of spiritual succession you see in Tunic, where it gives you this holistic world that is in decay, that feels strange and mysterious, and that doesn't work the way you quite expect it, and that is just so packed with secrets to discover. But now, none of that is why I'm bringing it up. What a great game that I could talk about all that stuff and not even reach my main point here. But this is what I was trying to say at the start, which is, it distracts you with how great all of this stuff on the surface is, that you don't even notice that the nuts and bolts are also incredibly cool. So I mentioned a second ago that it's in this mostly fixed, vaguely top-down-ish, kind of isometric-ish perspective, and that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the camera in Tunic, because this is one of those great ideas that is in Tunic that is overshadowed by its big ideas. I love the camera in Tunic. I love the way it works. So there's a lot of different games that have come out over the past 10 years that take advantage of how specifically things can be concealed by an isometric perspective. I don't think any of them have taken as much advantage of that as Tunic has, where every screen of the game there is some passageway that you can't see just because the camera doesn't nudge to the side a little. But once you know it's there, fits in so naturally into the landscape, works well. But even that is not what's so interesting to me about it. What's interesting to me about it is that unlike those other games that have taken advantage of this style in these ways, it's not a fixed camera. And I don't just mean that in a couple spots it swings to show you the secret or whatever. I mean it's just genuinely not a fixed camera. The main exception you'll see in gameplay is that when you lock on to the enemy, it tilts to give you a better sense of horizontal positioning. There's also a few kind of cylindrical or round zones where the camera becomes a tracking camera instead, just to give you a different perspective on things, just to give you a different experience, and also to sell the roundness. I mean, round is a shape that can be very difficult in isometric, but my favorite exception to the fixed camera in Tunic is the boss fights. When you walk in to the boss arena and you lock onto the boss, the camera cuts loose completely from the fixed perspective, and it has this new goal of trying to keep the player character between the camera and the boss. It just brings those moments to life. It makes them so much more exciting. Suddenly, the camera is just swinging around and swooping from side to side and keeping everything in frame and cinematic, but also making sure that everything is still clear. It's such a little thing, but it gives so much climactic energy to those boss encounters. And it's also interesting that it sort of only is possible here because of the game's art style. I mean, any game with a 3D environment and a fixed perspective could do something like this, but most games wouldn't have consistent art on the back faces of geometry. Like, think of Hades, for example. It's built out of these beautiful illustrations. So, I mean, Hades is also a 3D game, but a lot of its level art is 2D art layered in front of 3D objects. So it couldn't pull that same move without having a huge amount of additional work done on it, or having the textures swivel, you know, like the trees in Super Mario 64. Billboarding, I think they call that, billboarding. I think both those styles have merits. Hades style and the Tunic style. I mean, maybe not the billboard trees quite so much. No, I mean, I'm sure that has its place too. Both those styles do have merits, though. Hades backgrounds are able to have, and generally do have, a lot more detail because they're 2D, and the creators always know from what direction you're going to be looking at them. But this camera behavior change in Tunic is a plus that I don't think people really appreciate or think about when it comes to its approach as compared to something like Hades, because I think most people would just say Tunic has a more simple art style, but they may not be considering the fact that by having such simple geometric objects that are fully 3D objects rendered in the game, that it can play with the camera more, that it can play around and come more alive, hide stuff when the camera is fixed, but then swing loose for these dramatic moments. It's actually kind of hard for me to even think of things I don't like about Tunic. Oh, one thing I'll say is I don't like that there is exactly one of the bonus collectibles that requires you to translate the manual. The fact that you can do 99.5% of the stuff that is in the game just by careful deductive reasoning based on the layout of the manual and the symbols in the manual and everything, and the map system, does make me wish that there was some way that you could get that one collectible without having to do the full translation. And I know there's a hint. I know there's hints for the translation work, but it's just such an outsized amount of effort for something that I really feel like should have been just disconnected from mechanical progress in every way. That should have just been a optional extra for people that want to dig in, that want to know the full story, that want to know what all this funny flavor text in the manual is. But that's really not, I mean, it's not a complaint that matters at all. And even getting the bonus collectibles it's pretty arguable whether that's even mechanically relevant to the game, other than the fact that the pedestal room that they go in is pretty conspicuous. Tunic is just super cool. Do play Tunic. Stinkoman 20xd6 is a Flash game that originates on the website homestarrunner.com. It's a perfectly competent Mega Man clone, or maybe Mega Man parody would be a more accurate way of putting it. Fair to say that it would probably hold limited interest to someone who's not already a fan of the independently made web cartoon to which it is a supplement. I do remember it having a surprisingly fun take on an escort level toward the middle, and then the final level is a shoot 'em up. Well, not the final level. So that's what I want to talk about, actually. So what's interesting to me about Stinkoman 20xd6, and the reason it's in this lineup of games to talk about in this video, apart from the fact that I wanted one of the games I talked about to be a Flash game, is its very unusual release window, or production history. It's a game that spans 10 levels, and the first 9 levels were all released in 2005. I think it was across no more than 6 months total. But then if you got to the end of the 9th level, which was the shoot 'em up section that I was talking about, you just got a splash screen that said, 10th level's a coming. But then it never did. For many years, there was no 10th level. I'd say to all the world, it seemed like almost an intentional joke. It would be in keeping with the sense of humor that was behind the game and behind a lot of the parody games that the Brothers Chaps and their collaborators were making for the Homestar Runner website, for it to just be unfinished, for it to just purposefully end with this splash screen that says final level to come. Most people, at least, probably didn't think that any more was coming when it had been years and nothing happened. Except 15 years later, in 2020, the 10th level then did release. So what's noteworthy here is that this is a pretty serious edge case that someone could raise in regards to something I say in the Half-Life video. In that video, I'm talking about the fact that there is no accessible, metaphysical, objective standard by which we could determine where one artwork ends and another starts. That if we are to establish any standard that has communal utility or conversational utility, that it's going to have to be one that we construct specifically for that purpose, that we choose to use because it has that utility. And one consequence or one related facet of the standards that I propose in that video as prospective possibilities for doing that kind of thing is the idea that a game isn't necessarily finished on the day it releases. That as long as the original developers are still working on the game and developing material that goes into the game itself, that it can be considered to be, the way I put it is, in a prolonged state of public development. And Stinkoman here is not the longest window I can think of even during which that kind of work has been done. For example, Dwarf Fortress first became publicly available to download a year after this simple Flash game I'm talking about, but was then in active development. It's still in active development, technically. So we're talking about 20 years there that game's been in a prolonged state of public development by its original developers. But that, I don't think, is any real challenge to what I was talking about. It's an unusual situation, certainly, but everyone's kind of on the same page. So in terms of conversational utility, we understand this is a work that is ever-changing. It's kind of like a palimpsest. Even if they never really say Dwarf Fortress is complete, that's fine. People will still treat it as whatever the artwork is at the time the development on it stops by its original developers. There's lots and lots of paintings that are considered notable even though they're not finished. So that's no real challenge to anything that I was saying, at least in my opinion. But I think there's a slightly different thing going on here with Stinkoman over here, which is that it was presumed complete. There could have been, as far as I know, there wasn't, but there could have been a group of scholars working on Stinkoman and delving into the meaning of it. Maybe they'd be specialists in farce or parody or something, or maybe it would be work that would spill out from someone who's just an expert in that era of internet culture, or even specifically of the Homestar Runner website and all of the work by the Brothers Chaps. It's imaginable. It's imaginable that there could have been someone who treated this as a complete work and provided analysis of it as a complete work. And I think it's a much more legitimate edge case here to say that we have what seems to us to be a presumed complete work, and then 15 years later, it's expanded. It might feel fairly low stakes when it's something that has this look and feel of casual comedy and entertainment. That's one thing, but maybe what we could do is we could imagine, if, I don't think Charlotte Bronte lived a particularly long time, but if we imagine that she did, and that late in life, she decided to write an extra chapter for Jane Eyre. and that in this chapter, the character does something that was not established that they would do earlier on, like say Jane actually leaves Rochester or something like that. Suddenly, I don't think that it would be illegitimate to say that the book with the chapter added there, even though we could say it forms a whole coherent artwork with the material that was written earlier on, I think it would still be legitimate to say that these are two different books. So maybe I'm kind of talking myself back around to just kind of reiterating a point in the Half-Life video, actually, because I think ultimately we have to admit that all that really separates these works from each other, that all that really lets us know whether Stinkoman 20XT6 is one game or two games is, I think I called it at the time, something like the perception of sufficiently minimal difference. Something like that. That perception of sufficiently subtle difference, maybe that's how I put it. And I suspect that most people would say that in Stinkoman, we meet that standard, that this is the same game because we perceive the difference to be sufficiently subtle, because it all forms a coherent work that doesn't feel distinct from the work as it existed before. Maybe what it really goes back to, though, is the point I make in that same video where I say that possibly the different updates or versions of a particular game will have to be considered the same way that scholars consider the different renditions or versions of an ancient myth. And so it won't just be a matter of talking about Stinkoman 20XT6. You'll talk about it as a whole, but when you talk about Stinkoman 20XT6 in the theses of the future, as I'm sure there will be so many that cover this game, they would instead speak of an evolving meaning that covers the, whatever it is, 8 or so versions of the game. It's not significantly different from Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman wrote a number of poems, and then he modified those poems, and he added more poems, and he added more, and he modified those, and over the years you ended up with... So it was just this one growing text throughout his life. And scholars of Whitman basically have to deal with each of those individual poems at the different moments they exist. So when you work on a Whitman poem, if you're doing really serious analytical work, usually you're not just dealing with one poem as it exists at one point in time. I mean, you might be, you can, but it's likely that if you're doing a thorough job that you're starting from the early versions and you're working through the development of it and you're dealing with the changing meaning as it goes along. Anyway, I guess in terms of review, I'm not sure that I would recommend the game to most people. Like I said, I think folks who are familiar with the source material, and I don't mean Mega Man, I mean Strong Bad Emails, will enjoy it and honestly have probably already played it. Appeal for others may be limited. Last Call BBS was the very last game developed by Zachtronics, makers of Space Chem, Infinifactory, Opus Magnum. That's not super accurate to say because Zach Barth now works with Coincidence, and they made Kaizen, which is basically a Zachtronics game, but it still kind of marks the end of this era, and it's kind of odd because it's an anthology game. Nominally, the game is that you're accessing this old computer system and exploring the software that you can download through it. So what's interesting to me then is that it's kind of like a short story collection, and in particular, it's kind of like one of these classical short story collections that had a frame narrative, something like the Decameron. The stakes are presented as being a little lower. We're not exploring this computer system because a cataclysm has wiped out all newer computers or anything, but it does evoke that tradition to me. And while certainly some of the programs that are in it could have been full games, would have had enough meat on their bones for that, 20th Century Food Court obviously could have, and so could, I'm only going to try this once, The Forbidden Path. Should have just called it The Forbidden Path. Those two games could obviously have been full games, but then you look at something like Chip Wizard, and it's so identifiably Zachtronics, but there's just not enough material there, in my opinion, to have gone much further than they do here in Last Call BBS, and some of the other stuff is just a novelty more so than a game. Steed Force Hobby Studio, for example. So what's kind of neat about this is that games have always had this kind of odd relationship with being art, where they nest art within them whether or not they are art. It's super appropriate that I talk about this in a Zachtronics game because I will probably someday adapt some version of my article on Infinifactory, which is the only time I've ever really tackled directly this question of how we approach games as art. And that's very much about how art is an appellation from the consumer of the artwork onto the object they're interacting with, and it's about the way they interact with it. And so a single game, or games in general, are or not art on the level of the person consuming them. So everybody could, for example, agree that some particularly beautiful game that's being played has an extraordinary amount of gorgeous artwork in it, but you probably still won't get them all to agree that the game itself, which contains that glorious artwork, is itself art, and that the reason that that is true is because art is not something that is immutably applied to particular objects for all time by all people forever. Like I said, that's a topic I cover elsewhere, so that's not really what's interesting to me so much as the fact that here, one of those layers of material inside the game is game. People could make the case that some of the games in here, not just because they fall along those lines I was saying earlier of which ones have enough material in them to be full games on their own, but also just because of the mechanical relationships inside of them, that some of them work as artwork to them and others don't, or don't fulfill the art role in their lives. But that doesn't preclude somebody, in just the same way as saying that regardless of what they think of the artwork inside the game, they can make a different evaluation of a game. That doesn't preclude somebody from saying that they can make a different evaluation of Last Call BBS as an object on its own, as a collection. All of these different categories or collections operate as different concepts in people's minds. Like, they operate at different levels inside of people's minds. But it's kind of funny because when I wrote the Infinifactory article, I had not played Last Call BBS. I'm not actually 100% sure it had been released yet. And yet still, I ended that by saying that why I specifically am talking about Infinifactory in terms of this question of whether games are art is because Zachtronics has been pushing this envelope in such a specific and real way. Has been pushing the envelope on what is the level of interactivity you need. Has been pushing the envelope on how much practical utility can the skills you develop in games have, just on every kind of little fiddly category that people have been using over the history of games and the history of aesthetics as a discipline of philosophy to determine what counts as art, what doesn't. It's kind of amazing how much this one company in this one series of games, and then inside of this one game, has been providing meaningful examples that fall along this spectrum. I think a lot of really staunch advocates of games being art would have a lot of difficulty articulating what it means, for example, to say that solitaire is art, to say that every form of solitaire is art. Again, not saying it can't be done. Once you get to Steed Force Hobby Studio, you're asking yourself, is a jigsaw puzzle as a game a work of art? Is it a game? Even is a real question. And then you look at something like Dungeons and Diagrams and Hack Match, and these are games where you aren't doing role-playing in the classical sense of the term, even at some abstract level, except perhaps through the frame narrative of Last Call BBS. See, this is what I'm saying. It really is layered like this. But anyway, Dungeons and Diagrams could have been about anything. It could have had abstract symbols in it. It could have had just about anything in it. Hack Match didn't need to have a little robot, but didn't it though? Because once you start layering on that theming, you're making a whole work, and then that whole work says something different than those pieces would have said on their own. The mechanics behind the Forbidden Path would have a very different feeling if it wasn't a game about genetically engineering strange organ meat. And then now to layer on top of all of that, is Last Call BBS a game? Is it an anthology? What is it? There might be worth in those debates. Maybe there isn't. And maybe there isn't. Okay, and then just to make sure that this counts as a review, here's my ranking of all the games in Last Call BBS. Could take or leave Steed Force Hobby Studio. I'm sure it'll please a lot of people who have very particular tastes, but it ain't what I look for out of games. I don't mind, but I've never been particularly enamored of Zachtronics' different solitaire experiments. I think they're fine. I've never been huge on solitaire. I think Chip Wizard Professional is probably the driest take they have ever done on the Zachtronics formula is the most like a learning program, a piece of very simple pro-grade software that you could find in their catalog, more so even than TAS 100 or Shenzhen IO. But I have to be careful or else I'll just be drawn back into the art discussion, so let's move on. The next rung up would be Hackmatch and Dungeons and Diagrams. I think both of them are excellent little experiments. Hackmatch, I liked it when it was in Exapunks, and I like it here too. Really does feel like it leaps straight off of the Genesis or Master System in this one. Dungeons and Diagrams, for its part, is an excellent little logic game. Feels right at home alongside, say, Picross, if you've ever played that. Or for something lighter on context, maybe Sudoku would be another relatively close comparison. Great execution of it, and fun theme they chose for what all the little elements are. Comes together nicely. And then right up at the top of the pack is 20th Century Food Court and The Forbidden Path. Can't choose between them. They're in first place. They are just Zachtronics games. They are fantastic Zachtronics games, honestly. I would have loved to see either of them be a full experience. 20th Century Food Court, once you get the sequencer, you can solve everything with the sequencer. So it has that weakness, maybe, would need some kind of balance tweaks, possibly. But it's still great, and honestly, it's still even then, it's kind of fun to just cram a bunch of the sequencers in and make them work together. And anyway, The Forbidden Path is just a fun puzzle game. It's just an interesting puzzle game, and definitely one that I'm so glad they chose such weird theming for, because it really makes it feel so different from anything else that they did in their career up to that point. Anyway, solid game. Zachtronics is just fantastic, and they are so unique and so interesting, and they are just one of the best examples of what you lose if you don't play indie games. There's nothing like... There's certainly nothing like Last Call BBS, but I'd be hard-pressed to say there's anything that really strongly resembles Space Chem in any AAA game ever made. Logic Bombs is the first game created and released by the independent game critic Matthew Matosis. Looks to me to follow very directly from a combination of Picross and Dungeons and Diagrams from Last Call BBS. And in fact, it turns out that it started life as an effort by Matt to port Dungeons and Diagrams from Last Call BBS to the Game Boy. But I guess at some point in that process, he decided to just make his own thing. So he kept the constraints of working on the Game Boy, but then just applied that to his own concept and his own puzzle designs. And what I want to talk about here is onboarding, or tutorializing. Bringing the player into the game, getting them up to speed with the mechanics, and getting them playing. I think it's something that this game, despite it being very, very bare bones, very simple, is something that it does really well. You can tell that this is a game that has an audience of adults in mind. It doesn't give you a lot of flash, a lot of pomp, a lot of circumstance. It just gives you this interesting set of mechanics or rules and lets you see the play out of those rules yourself and reason out all of the kind of complex logical relationships that fall out from just this small rule set. And I think that's the right approach. I think if you have an audience in mind of people who are familiar with the medium, who've been playing games their whole life, that you should probably approach design and teaching from a position of maturity, of expecting that your audience is mature and reasonable. And that's not to say that you can't be patronizing or overbearing, even if your target audience is children. You absolutely can, and it's still a problem, and it's still a mistake. I recently had the opportunity to be sitting next to my niece while she played through the opening of Pokemon Legends, and even at the age of 7, she found its tutorial stuff overwrought, like too slow. I mean, she didn't say overwrought, but she found it too slow. She found it incredibly boring. And I've heard that's even one of the less offensive titles in this regard that they've made in the past few years. Something is rotten in the state of Game Freak. But I suspect avoiding that kind of situation in Logic Bombs comes from Matthew's decade of work as a game critic, because putting yourself in that position impels you to interrogate why you prefer certain designs over others, how you like to be treated as a player. But I'd like to be clear that this kind of onboarding situation, what I find so praiseworthy here, isn't just that the tutorial is minimal and brief and unobtrusive, but it is also just how much it doesn't tell you. By minimal, I don't just mean, it gets these rules out and that's all you need to know. It still can be a pretty complicated game at times. There are areas where you're likely to get stuck. But what it does is it has this structure where it has a couple little bottlenecks that you're forced through, where you learn some new rule, or your attention is brought to some new rule, or there's a new mechanic introduced. And then once you've gone through whatever this little sequence of teaching puzzles is for the new mechanic, then you're set free into another big, wide set of puzzles that you can tackle in any order. But what's cool is, what I really appreciate about it, is that the puzzles where you are learning a new mechanic often aren't just teaching you the rule that they say they are. They're often also designed to draw your attention really directly to something that has been true all along, but which you might not have noticed before. So here's a clip of one of the puzzles toward the middle of the game that is a good example of what I'm talking about, where specifically what they're trying to teach you here is just that there's this sum symbol that just tells you the sum of all of the numbers on that side of the board. The way it works is that it only shows you the sum for the numbers that are known, not for the variable numbers. But the other thing that you would notice from this puzzle right here, and the reason why it's a perfect puzzle with which to teach that mechanic, is that apart from that, you should also now notice that obviously the only way this puzzle scenario can work out is if all of the numbers on the y-axis and all of the numbers on the x-axis sum to the same value. So once you consciously notice or reason that out, you'll know the unknown quantities have to be 0 here, because the sums are the same, so there can't be a difference in the question marks. I mean, this kind of thing is true in any similar puzzle type with numbers that tell you about the same array of tiles from 2 directions. Like, it is true in any nonogram or pick cross puzzle as well, but you would rarely, maybe never, need to consciously know that to solve a pick cross puzzle. So here is a puzzle design where sometimes you absolutely do need to know that. And so here is a puzzle where once that has become true, you are compelled to notice it. Part of solving this puzzle right here is just noticing that fact. And then the immediate next puzzle after that one, without saying anything at all, without any additional text, tests whether you learned and internalized that lesson by just giving you a difference of 1 between the sums. So if you learned both the explicit and implicit lessons being taught in the prior puzzle, then you'll know that there can only be 1 wall anywhere in the unknown lines. Clever stuff. I do think logic bombs can be fairly criticized for theming and music. I'm not saying that there should have been music in the levels. I think it was probably actually a pretty good call not to have that. It's a long enough game, simple chiptune, probably would have got pretty annoying after a while. But I can't help feeling like menu music would have been good to give some personality, some additional identity to the game. I feel like when I think about games, when I think about specific games, a lot of the time, one of the first things that pops into my head is the music that you hear on startup, or the sound effects that you hear on startup. And those being really minimal, really nothing here, probably does kind of harm the memorability of the game. And I could understand if he, in part, didn't want to have music in it because he's not a musician and wanted it to be entirely his own creation, top to bottom. I get that. I've played enough games on the Game Boy and the NES and stuff to say there is a good chance that even if he had done minimal learning, minimal experimenting, that he probably could have made a chiptune that was less offensive than some stuff that has been in published games in the 90s. And then what else did I say? Theming. So by theming, I mean like the layer of character and concept that you put on top of your mechanics. You know, why are we bombing the cats? I can understand why every cat might need access to water. But why can you only kill 1 cat with 1 bomb? These are things that make enough mechanical sense, but absolutely no logical sense at all, which is kind of funny for a game that tells you it's going to move you to a realm of pure logic. Again, it's kind of similar to the music thing. It just feels like there was room there to make something more memorable, more engrossing, something that would stick with the player a little more if it felt like it actually had a setting and it has a sound, you know? Right now, I feel like the premise has to be that the reason we say we're in a realm of pure logic is because we're so far abstracted from notions of rational reality that I just have to say the only things that make sense are the laws of logic as they pertain to this nonsense zone. I don't know. Maybe a contradiction, maybe not. Hard to say. Still a good puzzle game. Even taking into account it's such a small game, so limited in scope, I'd still say pretty impressive. If I remember correctly, I think it's only $5, and I was pretty sure that was going to translate to no more than about 5 hours of gameplay, but actually it took me over 20 hours to beat the whole game, to beat every puzzle in it. So that's 4 times the value I was expecting. Pretty solid. Isles of Sea and Sky. So here's another puzzle game. This one is more like Sokoban style, so it's a block pushing or tile pushing, tile moving, tile arranging puzzles. It's another one with a really small team in terms of the raw creation of the material you see in the game. I think you're looking at 2 people. And once again, this is a game that does a tremendous job of onboarding the player, quietly respecting the intelligence and experience of the player. And specifically what I like so much about Isles of Sea and Sky is that I'm someone who played a lot of the Zelda games as a child, was really fond of them, but as an adult, admittedly, I do find most of the puzzle stuff in those games so simple that it makes it kind of hard to fully enjoy them. They're clearly designed to be adventures that are engrossing for kids, and as a result, the puzzles are designed to be solved by kids. Zelda is no stranger as a series to block pushing puzzles, but they're usually extremely basic puzzles. So you could say that what Isles of Sea and Sky felt like to me is it felt like a natural evolution or development of the gameplay and visuals of, say, the Game Boy Color Zelda games. Actually does have a really similar vibe to Link's Awakening, which I really like Link's Awakening. Zelda's way of doing things isn't wrong, by the way, obviously. Just thought I should clarify that. Zelda games offer challenges other than puzzles, they have goals other than being challenging, and they offer a holistic experience that's still very compelling. But I would be lying if I said that I found the puzzle gameplay in particular as compelling as I found it when I was a kid. And if you played a lot of that stuff as a kid too, and you're ready to have a proper challenge and can reason through logic puzzles, then by all means check out Isles of Sea and Sky. Now, where my defense of it wears thin, still very, very fond of this game, but here I want to talk about offboarding, let's call it. So if onboarding is all of that wonderful stuff where they tell you the minimum you need to know, put you in a situation to figure this stuff out for yourself to the greatest degree possible, or to learn by doing, then offboarding would be how it goes about telling you that you have reached a satisfactory conclusion point and can or should move on to something else. If you're the type of person who will reach whatever the very first ending of a game is and then immediately move on, no questions asked, then if you like this kind of stuff, you're going to have an amazing time. My opening run from starting the game to getting to that first ending, I was extremely enamored of the game. I thought it was fantastic. Like I said, it's a 2D Zelda for someone that grew up playing 2D Zeldas. But then the post-game stuff is designed in that way, you'll see sometimes, where it just kind of expects you to eventually wander off. As far as I can tell, there was no reward for me getting all the Pyramidions. There was no indication I'd even got them all, other than there being an achievement, and then I couldn't find any more. For getting all the obsidian and all the keys, there's not even an achievement, so I don't know if there were extra keyholes, or if there are just more keys in the game than there are locks. The best you can do, I think, at that point is just kind of tour around the world on your turtle, around the world map, just to see that there are no more of the content indicators on the islands. And if any of that stuff actually locks away anything at all, like even just an ending, even a new cutscene, if it locks anything, not gameplay, but just if there's anything that is any kind of reward for doing all that stuff, it wasn't something I encountered, that doesn't mean it isn't there. And then supposedly there's even some further class of like even more secret collectibles. But as a person playing alone, without looking stuff up, I had no in-game indication that those were there. And I will say that the leaps in logic that I had to make to gather the last 5 or so of the Pyramidions really did not inspire confidence in circling back for what remained. I do think that the actual ending cutscene that you get when you just go to the end of the game did seem to change when I got 120 stars, which was cool. I liked that. And the extra stuff beyond that, having no obvious story consequences and fewer apparent player hooks the further you go, it's all stuff that could be improved in the future update. But the game, as it was at the time of me saying this, at least, will still be a good example of how if you just keep adding purely mechanical post-game additions that don't seem to have quite the level of polish or playtesting that the developer put into the base game stuff, it can kind of confuse and encumber an otherwise really solid experience. It's still a genuinely fantastic game, recommend it to anybody who likes puzzle games, but some of that bonus content that's in it has given it the feeling of being slightly unfinished. Which is funny, because I'm sure it didn't feel that way before the extra stuff was added. Goes to show what a double-edged sword post-game support can be. Dandara is a game in the vein of Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. What folks have convinced me since my Death's Door review could possibly be called a search action game or action adventure. You get the idea. The unique selling point of this one is the way that you control the character, which is very unusual, very unique. You can't manually move left and right or up and down in small, normal movement increments. Instead, you have to snap from one surface directly to an opposing surface. You have to wall jump, basically. So I think these strange controls, even though they're kind of the main selling point of the game, have probably put a lot of people off of it. It released on a bunch of platforms simultaneously, but a lot of folks have said that these are touch-centric controls, that what they're perhaps primarily designed for is for mobile gaming, because it's so easy just using a touch interface to move the character directly across to the other spot with just a single tap, whereas something like conventional left, right, up, down movement typically requires something like a D-pad, and on a mobile device that would usually require a virtual D-pad or a peripheral. But what's interesting to me is that even though there may be a kernel of truth there, that it may actually have been designed to be on mobile devices first, I think it's a better game when it's taken away from touch controls, that the unusual way of moving around this game world feels best, works best on a conventional controller, on a more typical gaming rig, on a PC, say, or on a console. And the reason that I say this is because once you have much more precise control, like you get from using the analog sticks to angle your jumps and then just needing to tap a button on the other side for every individual jump, you get this extremely fast movement, this unusually speedy navigation. You can just be zipping through the rooms, just absolutely tearing across this game. And it makes one of the conventional low points for a lot of people in these kinds of discovery and exploration games, which is backtracking. It makes that almost totally pain-free. So there's nothing that controls quite like it, and I can kind of see why. I mean, there's sort of a disorienting effect, I think, to being able to actually move this fast most of the time. But it's just so satisfying, because it's not even as though it's difficult. I mean, it's so easy to just kind of spam the button and just be tilting the stick around and just move from place to place. Honestly, I really like Dandara. I think it's pretty underrated, and that people are pretty harsh on it for some really weird reasons. I like its world, I like the specific way that it does the kind of Link to the Past Dark World stuff, and it's got a really interesting and compelling true ending encounter tucked away at the end of it. Yet another in a long line of games that, as I'm saying, have mechanical experiments that you're just probably not going to see if you just stick to whatever's on the top of the year lists. Whatever has the biggest budgets, you're gonna miss out. You're not going to be given new ways to move around that feel this new. Staying in a similar genre, but moving to a very different pace of game, a much slower way of moving around the world, here's Blasphemous. Probably one of the best known games that I'm covering here, and another one that is just great. It's a great game with a unique setting. It's got awesome pixel art, very solid world layout, some great power scaling as you move through the game. Anyway, my reason for bringing up Blasphemous here is not just random praise, it's random criticism. So there's one major annoyance that just really kind of put me off right at the last second in this game. And kind of similar to the Isles of Sea and Sky discussion earlier, it's something that wasn't true when the game was released. But there is an ending, which I believe is the third ending, final ending, added in one of the game's DLCs, is, as far as I know, I haven't actually played the sequel yet, but as far as I know, is the one that the sequel canonizes, says is the true ending of the game. So the annoyance is that the cutoff for getting that ending comes just before the point of no return, your final save point before finishing the game. They lock out seeing that ending because of your inability to go back and repeat one boss fight, the one that you had just finished. So a final save point difference of probably less than 10 minutes requires the player to replay like a 14-hour game to see the last ending. And I was thinking a lot about, why this annoys me, but something like the way that Demon Souls and Dark Souls handle their endings doesn't, when it seems kind of oddly similar. And the answer I came to is essentially that you don't have to involve yourself. You can, but don't have to involve yourself in additional work and additional plot threads to access the endings in those games. You come to the end, and based on what you know of your character and what you know is possible in that scenario, you make a decision. And these decisions are alternatives. But yeah, you role play out what's going to happen there. Blasphemous is telling a slightly more defined, specific story, and it actually lets you, at that point of no return moment, at that final save point, actually lets you go back, scuttle around the map, mopping up all the collectibles. It'll even actually let you go kill both of the optional bosses that are required for seeing that last ending. So you can do all of the actual quest requirements, but then you can't then proceed to the ending. So this one decision to have the save point be there, to have the save point be after that fight instead of before it, really limits, probably very significantly, the number of players who will have seen what the sequel tells us is the actual ending of the game. And to be clear, in Blasphemous, you can miss one requirement for the ending earlier on before you get to that point of no return, but that's it. If you satisfied that one thing, yeah, so it's not an either-or ending, and it's not like it results from a bunch of moral choices you made throughout the campaign. There's just this one fork, and then these optional bosses, and yeah. Oh, and since I'm whining anyway, it was a bad idea. It was a bad idea to make passive character upgrades for getting around be something that you have to equip on your character, because they also then limit the player to, I think it's 3 slots for equipping them. Points for trying to mix up something from its genre, I guess. But all that really does is put a layer of menu navigation between you and some basic action your character can do, like access the blood platforms or go through toxic gas or drop down in pits. It's not ideal, I'll say. But don't let all of that distract you from the fact that Blasphemous is very, very good. Shovel Knight Dig is one of the Shovel Knight spin-offs that have been made since the conclusion of development by Yacht Club Games on the 4 mainline Shovel Knight titles. So they partnered with a couple other studios to make a couple other games that have Shovel Knight as the central character, but are structured differently. Both of the games are roguelikes. So there was sort of a weird puzzle roguelike called Pocket Dungeon, which actually I thought was pretty good. Not at the level of quality of the 4 mainline games, but good for as much fun as Showdown, probably, unless you have some really dedicated group of friends that likes to play Showdown. But what I want to talk about is Shovel Knight Dig. So Shovel Knight Dig is developed in collaboration with a company called Nitrome. And if that name is familiar to you, then you probably got about 70% more interested in Shovel Knight Dig just now by me saying that. And if it's not, I'll tell you. Nitrome is probably the makers of the broadest array of high-quality Flash games that was released in the era of Flash domination. Nitrome's incredibly prolific, and a lot of their games feel like these little mechanical experiments where the entire idea is they just ask themselves, can you have compelling gameplay where you don't actually get to decide where your character goes, just when they go? Can you have compelling gameplay where you're controlling 2 characters that are tied together? What about a game where you don't control the character, you activate things in the level? Or what about a game where your only way of getting around is a grappling hook and you have nothing else, basically? So they take that kind of concept, they wrapped it up in a nice little pixel art package, and they threw it out on their website to be played for free so they could make some ad revenue. And then they did that dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And so, as a result, they became, for me, one of the best providers of mechanical variety when I was younger. Anyway, the angle or spin I want to put on this section is I want to talk about mechanical adaptation. So I think a big problem that a lot of players had when they were first faced with the prospect of Super Meat Boy Forever, very underrated game, is that they didn't like the mechanical change. They didn't like that it didn't feel to them like a Meat Boy game, because both Meat Boy and Super Meat Boy have this distinctive momentum-based, slippery feel to them, especially Super Meat Boy. And a big part of being able to have a momentum-based system is being able to build up momentum, obviously, and you can't really do that in an auto runner. So to them, it felt like a lot of identity was lost because that aspect of the mechanic was lost. And I'm empathetic to that point of view. I don't necessarily agree that that's a reason that Super Meat Boy Forever should be criticized. I think it can be judged on its own merits, and that if judged as an auto runner in terms of the goals that the developers had for the game, it is an excellent auto runner. But it certainly raises an interesting question of how much of the specific mechanical identity and mechanical nuance of a game is inextricable from the identity of that game. It's yet another of these thorny Ship of Theseus type problems, but at a much smaller scale, much more specific scale. Like a person going through life, characters kind of exist on a continuum in a lot of games, and not just ones with defined leveling systems. There's so many ways that characters can gain abilities and lose abilities, and you can move into side quests and pick up gadgets and new weapons and learn new moves and so on and so forth. They exist on this continuum, and so the question is, at what point along that continuum should a delineation be made? And it seems like the answer that most people would give is that you could almost put that defining line anywhere and say, this is something different in the event that these two things appear in different games. So if, say, there had been auto runner levels in Super Meat Boy, then I don't think anybody would have batted an eye at them very much. You know, people might have opinions about them. People might say, you know, I prefer this set of levels, I prefer that set of levels. This isn't that weird of an idea. Crash Bandicoot games often include auto runners, where you're riding on animals or vehicles. And similarly, Mario games often have levels that are auto scrollers, where you still control the character manually, but you don't control the pace of progress. Nobody really says Crash isn't Crash when he is riding on the hog. Nobody says Mario isn't Mario on an airship. But if Nintendo had instead kept Mario's gameplay super pure, super undistilled platforming, and then released a separate game in which every level is an auto-scroller, then people might be like, that's not Mario. It wouldn't surprise me to see that kind of reaction. Now, what does any of this have to do with Shovel Knight Dig? Well, specifically, what I want to talk about here is what's called the shovel drop. So, Yacht Club games, Shovel Knight, the original Shovel Knight, if you attack downwards, you hold down while you're in the air, you hold the shovel below yourself, and you can actually bounce off of enemies. And you use this for platforming, you use this to get around. You can even bounce off certain blocks if you've got the button held. But there's a subtle change made in Shovel Knight Dig where what happens is, when you're in the air, for any reason, at any time, you just walk off a ledge, you jump yourself. I think even if you get knocked back by an enemy, you go into an automatic shovel drop. So anytime Shovel Knight in Shovel Knight Dig is in midair, the shovel is underneath them and they will bounce automatically on any bounceable block, on any enemy. It's not optional, it becomes mandatory. It doesn't take long to get used to or anything, but it is something that a lot of players in reviews I've seen have actually complained about. There's some uproar, like, is this really Shovel Knight if I'm not in control of when the shovel drop is happening? You know, I don't want them to do this for me. I don't want this. I don't want that. That kind of thing. But it's such a subtle change that it really gives me pause to see that. And what's more, I also think it raises a question of presentation that's very interesting to think about. Because bouncing off of enemies automatically once you're in the air, just bouncing as soon as you land on top of an enemy, that's not unique in a platformer. It's a real common, old-fashioned way of interacting with enemies. That's what Mario does. Mario's feet are his shovel drop. If he lands from midair on top of a Goomba, he's going back up. But something about the animation, specifically showing that Shovel Knight is doing something unique in the air, and that's causing the bounce, makes the players seem to want to say, I should be the one choosing to do that. I get to do that. You almost feel like if Mario was animated to put on a giant boot, and I don't mean the giant boot power-up, I mean like he just pulls a boot on whenever he's in midair, that maybe some players would start to say, why don't I get to pick when he's wearing his bouncing boot? So player psychology is such a funny thing sometimes. It really comes down to not just when in the game different mechanics are available, whether those mechanics are available across titles or within a single title, and then even how the mechanics are animated. Every step along that line contributes to whether or not players will accept something as identically the same character, as identically the same experience, and as acceptable. I mean, there are some common complaints about Shovel Knight Dig that I think are pretty valid. It's not a roguelike with a lot of variation between runs, but I still think the journey to getting all of the items unlocked and at least seeing the true ending once is a solid one. It's a worthy outing for Shovelry. I guess if you ever ask yourself, what would it be like if Shovel Knight had best-in-class pixel art and some downwell DNA, then you should be checking this game out. Just another good example of the approach I described in my Enter the Gungeon video. Got my 100% at almost exactly the 20-hour mark, saw what felt like everything the game had to offer, enjoyed my time with it, satisfied, moved right along to another game. And on the subject of how visuals can, for better or worse, set expectations for players, Tori 2. Back in the early 2000s, a company called Two Tribes made a simple level-based order of operations puzzler for the Game Boy Color called Tori. Then, for whatever reason, they just kept porting and remastering or remaking it for other platforms for the next, 10 years. I have played some of the Game Boy Color game and all of the remake that is on Steam. And the main thing that stood out to me while playing the remake is what a mess the visuals are. Puzzle design's fine, it's competent, holds up all right, but the look of this game, it has the same energy as that meme making fun of HD texture mods for retro games with the cat. Some of the enemies are these chunky, low FPS things. They look kind of like claymation. Some of them are sprites. The player character is like a high-res 3D model. And most of the game, including the main character, is just in this gaudy, soulless, childish, super bright art style. It's like a Happy Meal toy. It looks like a game you'd get on a disc in a cereal box. Not that it's low effort. I mean, it's not low effort. It isn't, I don't think. I'm just saying it's unattractive. Also, with the sheer amount of additional content and polish that's on it, I'd say it's probably still a slightly better game overall than its Game Boy Color predecessor, but it's an ugly duckling. Anyway, after that, they made a sequel with a much more interesting take on similar type of gameplay and almost the same art style. But I cannot overstate how great the puzzle design is in this game, in Tori 2. The approach to puzzle design here is just amazing. It is a fully open world, wordless tutorial, knowledge-gated puzzle game. Antichamber came out the same year as this game, and is much, much more well-known because of all of its non-Euclidean stuff, because of the spatial trickery that's very famous about that game. But Antichamber is actually way, way less of a knowledge-gated game, what folks have started calling Metroidbranias, than Tori 2. So many of Antichamber's puzzles just revolve around unlocking the different cube guns. In the old Tori, original Tori, there's a whole arsenal of tools, and you might get a certain number of uses, you might get some of them in one level and some of them in another. In this one, you just start with these two abilities. You've got the whistle and you got the stomp. And that's it. That's all you get for the whole game. And they're both available immediately, right at the start of the game. And then getting around the game world, getting to anywhere in the game world is possible right away. You just have to figure out how the animals that are in this world interact with those two abilities and how those animals interact with each other. That's pretty much it. If you can figure that stuff out in any given scenario, you can make progress in that scenario. Very cool. Badly in need of a proper undo button, though, I will say. Checkpoints is how they do it, and the checkpoint approach definitely does lead to some tedium at times. There should also have probably been like twice as many fast travel points on the map. Will really only matter to completionists though, so not a huge deal. But it looks like a cheap playset. Don't get me wrong, it looks better than the first game. It's cohesive, like consistent this time. It's not like this mix of different art styles. It all just looks like the Happy Meal toy now. I talk about this a little bit in my video on the Portal games. You really want tone and visual design, puzzle complexity, all those elements to achieve a mutual cohesion. This game looks more kid-friendly than a Kirby title, but is a hard enough puzzle game that I think a lot of players would not be able to finish it. There's just some stuff where you have to really experiment and really pay attention and really think through a few steps ahead. And part of that is just because of, having to go back to the checkpoint if you make even one little mistake. But part of that is because it's not the easiest puzzle game in the world. This might be the game that I have played with the widest divide between visual simplicity and mechanical density. If this game looked like Rain World, it would be talked about in reverence with hushed tones. Hell, if it just looked like a slightly edgier, slightly higher detail cartoon style, like if it looked like Awesome Knots, I think it would still be in a lot of people's top games of all time lists. But instead, the whole thing just looks dopey. And the really sad thing is that like none of the game, like no part of the game looks more dopey than the main character that you are controlling. So you're doomed to have every screenshot, every clip, every minute that you are in this game. You are doomed to have it look about as dumb as possible. It's just incredibly difficult to imagine who the target demographic of these newer Toki Tori games was supposed to be. Like 5-year-old savants, maybe. Okay, they're not that hard. They're really not that hard as puzzle games go. But seriously, at one point my wife was like, "Why are you playing a kid's mobile game?" And I was like, because it's one of the most mechanically daring puzzle games of the last 20 years. So there you have it. That's 10 games, 10 reviews, 10 mini improvised video essays. To reward you for watching all the way to the end, I've got this clip to share with you of me just absolutely decimating Garl Vinland with a series of consecutive parries. Poor Garl. Next month is when I'm planning to do the first of those exclusive live streams for anybody backing the Patreon, so if that sounds interesting, check it out. But just thank you again so much for being here. If you're new to the channel, that's fantastic, and I'm happy to have you. If you've been around for a long time, then I just can't be appreciative enough of you sticking around. And if you have been around a couple years, you may already know that I've had a rough go of it for the past couple years, but things are really turning around, and I like to think that hitting this milestone and turning this leaf for the channel and trying to reinvest my time and effort into the channel and into the underlying website and writing more is the best way to mark that turnaround. Oh, also, I'm going to be putting up a poll for those of you with voting power over on the Patreon to help me decide which of a few different topics is going to feature in the very next video on this channel. And the very next video in this channel will be back in my usual format. So since that's probably why you subscribed, was to see stuff in the usual format, I hope you'll enjoy it.